Hello, NG Houston. So tonight we're going to have fun. We have Denny and with the last episode, right, Denny?
That's right.
And tonight we have David, and we're putting David in the hot seat tonight, which is really fun because I like to give David a hard time. And David's super cool, and he's a lot of fun, and I think you guys are going to get a kick out of him and probably learn some cool stuff because I actually met David at NG Houston, and we were hanging out, and I got a big kick out of him. And then I ran across this ng-rosetta thing, and I was like, oh, wow, that looks really great. And I was telling Denny about it. And then I found out that it was David, my pal from ngconf, that wrote it, and I was all excited because he's super fun. So I'm glad, David, that you're here, and so we're going to put you in the hot seat tonight. Yeah. Cool. So, Denny, you want to kick it off and talk about what we're going to cover tonight? What you guys are going to cover?
Yeah. Let me go ahead and I'll go ahead and share my screen and pull up the slides.
Awesome.
You can't see that, or let me know if you can. You should see a slide.
We see it.
All right. Great. Okay, so as Bonnie said, we are here for the final session of our upgrade from AngularJS to Angular series. So tonight, we are going to look at some example migrations. If you followed along with our series, you know we started several weeks ago, early September, I believe. We introduced the series and we talked about how a year ago at this same time, we were just learning about this upcoming Angular 2, and we were trying to figure out as developers, how are we going to prepare ourselves in the midst of continuing to develop AngularJS code. So we learned about some of the concepts in Angular, and we decided to try to write an Angular 2 app at the time. Now we're a year later, and we realize there's a lot of us out there in industry that we really want to start taking advantage of the new Angular framework in our industry applications. And so we need to figure out a way to get our companies and our projects upgraded. So in our second,
Denny. Yep. Sorry, we see your presentation view, which is fine with us, but if you want to switch it around so you can focus on the...
Sure.
Inception. Share the wrong screen with us.
How about that?
That is perfect.
Is that right?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So after our introduction, we talked about Angular concepts, and we put them side by side to AngularJS to try to understand how does Angular look through our AngularJS lens, because many of us are familiar with AngularJS and wanted to know exactly what the differences were between the two. So we took a comparison and a contrast between the two, and we deciphered exactly what was different, what was new, what's changed in our first part, where we covered our introduction along with those conceptual comparisons. And then in our next part, we looked at the new development environment, and we saw that as developers, we're going to need to get familiar with some new things like TypeScript, the new build process, and the Angular CLI, which is really helpful in developing any kind of Angular code. And then we turned our attention to refactoring the way we think about Angular applications. So in AngularJS, there were some concepts like two-way binding, things like factory function services, all sorts of kind of mental overhead that we carried with us as we produced AngularJS apps. And we learned that there's some new principles that we need to pay attention to when we start to think about Angular applications, and that's the component architecture and unidirectional data flow. So those are two areas that we found out we can start learning about and practicing immediately, even within our AngularJS code. So we looked a little bit at that refactoring we can do with our existing code to prepare for that. And then last week, we saw that you can actually put Angular side by side with AngularJS code and use a helpful ng upgrade library produced by the Angular team to run them both at the same time. So using that library, you're actually able to iterate through an upgrade process of your own in your existing AngularJS project. And then that brings us to tonight, where we're going to highlight some example migrations. So first, we're going to review some of the migration paths that are available to us, and then I'm going to demo some of the preparation you can do in your AngularJS project to get it optimally ready for movement over into an Angular code base. And then David's going to take over and feature the ng-rosetta project, which is a public repository that's available that'll show you exactly how to upgrade all the way from an AngularJS 1.x version of an application all the way to an Angular application. Then we'll wrap up with some lessons learned and leave you with a few references for resources for planning your own upgrade. So first, we want to recall that there are several ways we can go about or approach an upgrade. The first is we could perform an entire rewrite from scratch, and that would involve standing up a new Angular project completely independent from our existing AngularJS project and just writing a new application in Angular, but using our existing AngularJS app as merely a specification or almost a requirements template. This will be practical only if you have a very small application. Our next option would be to refactor that existing AngularJS code towards Angular using some of those concepts that we covered earlier in our series, and then we could do a rewrite in Angular with a new project. Our third option would be to refactor the existing AngularJS project straight to Angular. And then the last option would be to refactor that existing AngularJS project and rewrite it in steps by introducing some Angular concepts and some Angular code into our existing AngularJS code base. So those last two paths are ones that we would have to use the ng-upgrade library to support, because that's what would allow us to run those two versions of the framework side by side. So I'm going to go ahead and show you an example of some of the preparation you can do with your AngularJS project. Our example application is called Memorization Coach, and it's simply an application to help users memorize something of importance to them. It could be a poem or a scripture or famous quote, or maybe a homework assignment if you're a student. The way the application works is a user will create a memorization program to deliver their content according to some schedule of their choosing. The application supports some basic things like user registration and login. You can create, update, and delete memorization programs. And then it runs a single program at a time. So any of the programs you set up, you're just focused on memorizing one piece of content. You select that program to run, and all of the scheduled time intervals that you have for that program will result in a browser alert each time that moment arrives. So I'm just going to log in and demo the app for you so you have an idea of what we're looking at here. So this is the console, the main user interface. And what we see here and highlighted is the current program that's running. So I'm just going to, we can pause this and turn them all off or edit it. And what I'm going to do is just add a time here so you can see it in action. So in the next minute here, we'll see if we can make this pop up our message. Meanwhile, look over here on the left. I'm going to show you what the code base looks like for this version of the application that's running. We have an app folder here, and you can see as we look at that, we see app.js, we see controllers, directives, models, and here on the right you see this is the alert. So this is what happens each time a scheduled moment arrives. So we can see controllers, directives, services, views, and when we look at that, if we didn't know what AngularJS was, we would not understand really what we were looking at or where to find application functionality. And even when we do know AngularJS, it's still kind of hard to know where am I going to find things like a login and how does this view come about? What does that look like, right? And speaking of views, we have all of our views lumped together here in one folder, right? So it's very difficult to grab the code that, supports or renders or interacts with a particular view. I have to bounce around my source code tree. So I wanted to show this because this is how we began writing AngularJS applications maybe 2-3 years ago for me. This was a lot of the stuff you saw online recommended this kind of structure. So if we look at our console over here, which we're viewing in the application, we can see the view has an ng-include to pull in a header, right? And then we've got a controller, I believe, that handles this. Let me find that just a minute here. So we go to our app.js. We see our configuration for our routes, and we've got a main controller, that controls this entire view, right? So anyway, so we see some of these somewhat outdated concepts here in this original code base. So let's look at an iterated version of this, a second version where we introduced component directives. Let me pull that up here. Give me just a second. First thing I want to show you is the difference in folder structure here. So our second version here is using directive components. We talked a little bit about this last week or a couple of weeks ago. And we see, if we expand just the app folder alone, we see already a dramatic difference, right? There's an auth and the server, and there's constants, and we've got this components folder that has login and program registration. So we can get a much better idea of what this application even does and the kinds of things it supports because we've organized our code by feature, right? So this is folders by feature approach to organizing your code. And so this is one of the things you want to do early on in preparing your code for migration. Also, just by looking at some of these things, you can see that these folder names somewhat indicate the intent of the application, right? So we see that there's some scheduling stuff here, and we know that, okay, there must be some type of program scheduling you can do here beyond your basic user login functionality. If we look at our top level configuration, we can see that there's a much cleaner implementation for our routes, right? We just have a simple route to component pairing, really, right? So we have our register route pairs with a register component, and it just seems a lot easier to read and understand how to get to certain functionality. There's less noise than when we look at something like our initial version, where we've got our separate component controllers and views, right? So the next thing we needed to do with this version is we introduced the concept of components. We touched briefly on this a couple of weeks ago. We want to take control of our data flow. And I think Bonnie last week on our panel, she made a good point that this was one of the more difficult transitions, and I had forgotten, but she was right. When I first started to try to use unidirectional data binding in doing this work right here, I did struggle with it quite a bit as well. It's a very different way to think about things since we've become real dependent on two-way binding. So I'm going to show you a slide and try to depict for you here what the difference is here. So This is our original version of the application where we have an edit route. So if you want to edit one of those memorization programs, we have the controller. The controller is provided a program object, and that program object has daily schedules that are part of its attributes. Those attributes, the daily schedules, are controlled and displayed through these daily schedules. And each daily schedule within the week has its own network of time inputs. So you saw that I added a time earlier. So that would happen here in the time input. Well, if I pull a program into this composition form that's controlled by this edit controller here, I start changing these values, that data immediately gets propagated up to the parent component due to two-way binding, and it goes up through the daily schedules, and it impacts the actual value that was passed into my controller as programmed. So I edit any of this data anywhere down in these components and these child components, and my original program object will be impacted. Its value will change. So we don't want that. We want to have a more controlled way to update those programs. So in this new directive component version, we introduced a couple of components through which data can pass through interfaces a little bit more controlled manner. So we start out at the top with an edit program controller, and that's going to deliver the program to our editor. The editor then delivers the daily schedules of the program into a weekly schedule entry component. So this component has a responsibility now of strictly managing just the weekly schedules part. And what it has done is creates a copy of whatever is passed in, and it labels that editable daily schedules. So now when I start changing the time and that low-level time input, that data will flow up to these daily schedules, but it's only going to affect the editable daily schedules until such time that I invoke a function in this weekly schedule entry to pass those updates up to the editor, the program editor. And that program editor then at this point has the responsibility, the ownership of the original program, so it can edit that data. But changing,
I really needed this diagram a year ago, Denny. Where
yeah,
were
I
you?
know, right? I hadn't drawn this yet, so
This is really cool. I wish that I had had this when I first learned this, because it would have been so much, I would have learned it a lot quicker.
yeah. Yeah, it's well, you reminded me, like I said last week, that this was one of the tougher parts of transitioning into this new component architecture view. So we can kind of see how this works. Let's look at the components themselves, and I just want to show you how we are restricting that data flow in and out of these components. So let's look at the program. We were just looking at the program, the edit program. The edit program, I believe, is at the top, and it's actually pulling in the original program. So just want to show you the bindings here are coming from the top. So this is still two ways. So the editor, let's look at the editor. So the editor here has this program coming in to it, right? And this is where it gets its data. And then to do those the weekly scheduling, we see that it gets its daily schedules, but then when those values are updated, it's passing those out through this on update signal to its parent. So, so now let's take a look at how this looks when we move from these component directives over to the component helper method that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So first thing we'll notice is that the structure is actually identical, the top level structure. So we didn't have to change anything. This is pretty easy then to transition. Once we've moved a lot of our code into folder by feature, and we've organized and implemented some of our code around components, we can drop those or transform the component directives into component helpers very easily. We'll see how this looks different in the top level routing as well. We've got just our component labels here. And then as we look at something like the console component, remember before the console pulled in a header and it had a main controller that was responsible for orchestrating all of its work. Well, now we've got a console here, or we've got a console component, and we have isolated it entirely from its container through this binding here. We don't have anything. It's not bound to anything. So it has to get its data from an outside source, which is the program storage, the database, the persistence layer. And then if we look at our HTML, our template for this, we've actually been able to remove this ng-include for the header, and we've formed a component out of that as well. So if we go to our shared components, we can see we've got this nice header component that we're able to import then into any other view that we want to use, right? So we've created this nice reusable piece, this header here. And then if we go back and look at some of those scheduling pieces, we can see how we can really restrict our data flow. So if we look at our weekly components again, in our last version, we still had a two-way binding. But now with the component helper method, we're able to introduce a one-way binding here, which means there'd be no way for us to update these schedules and impact the values that's passed into this component. So here we still take a copy of that and manage that copy within here. But when it's time to update that, we can send that up to its parent container component to actually edit the program. So the key thing that comes out of moving into this component helper is that it really forces you to think through your composition of your input and output for each component. And this is a very challenging exercise initially, but also starts to make a lot of sense the more you practice it. So now that I've shown you that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to David, and he can show you how to take your code from AngularJS preparation into Angular. So David, if you're ready, go ahead and share your screen.
All right. Hey, so I would like very much to make this as much of a live conversation as possible, right? I'm basically going to tell a story, right? So I'm going to show a whole bunch of source code, and I'm going to talk about some of the crazy stuff that I went through while I was creating that thing, and all that's really good. But these always work better when I've got interaction. So it's okay if people are shy. It's okay if you're not really sure what you want to ask. But if something that I say jogs your memory or piques your interest in terms of, I've always wanted to know how to do that, or I did it a way better way, Dave, you knucklehead, here's a better way to do that, right? These are much better when they're interactive. So please feel free to interrupt. Bonnie and Denny, I know I've got you guys as captive audiences, so please weigh in with your opinion. What's that?
I said be careful what you wish for.
I know what I'm asking for. I know my audience pretty well. Okay, so I'm just going to start off with a very high level, not that one. Not that one. Hang on a sec. Oh my gosh, did I lose all my, there we go. It's over here. I just want to show the repo. So here is the public version of ng-rosetta. There is a private version too, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I wanted to make sure everybody knew this is the source code you're going to see is all open source. It's all out there. I published it, I want to say 7 or 8 months ago after I wrote it over a year ago. And I have been making efforts to maintain it and keep it up to date. As you can see, the last thing I touched was a couple of months ago. So I'm lagging behind. And some of the reasons for that will be explained as we talk about this. So be aware this stuff is out there. You're free to pull it down. If you find something that needs to be improved or fixed, feel free to throw me a merge. That'd be awesome. That's the whole point of this thing, is not only for me to publish this stuff on behalf of Thomson Reuters, but also for us to get together and talk about ways to do this better. So if there's a means for us to benefit from what the open source community likes and doesn't like in terms of patterns, then this is the best way to do that. So having said that, let's talk a little bit about what the heck this thing is. I put together a presentation last September for my internal teams. I've got, I'd say there's 2,000 of us in the division of the company that I'm in. We're about 50,000 globally. Of those 2,000, I want to say about 800 developers or so comprise that that group. So I was touring the country, and I'm talking to most of those 800 developers, and talking about, okay, we've been doing Angular a certain way now for a few years. We've kind of got things standardized. We've got people using this stuff. We've got people feeding into our internal open source repositories. We use Git internally, which is great. We also use TFS, which is also great, but doesn't help us with some of our collaboration pieces. So all of my stuff's hosted in internal versions of Git, which has been great. So we've got that, right? That's done. That's a pre-existing pattern. We're all happy with it. Okay, here comes Angular 2. At the time, it was Angular 2, and we called it Angular 2, so I'm going to call it Angular 2.
You're such a rebel.
Yeah, well, that was back when it was Angular 2. Now you have to call it Angular, but we haven't gotten there yet. So yeah, this is aught 16. So the challenge was, okay, well, crap. There's a million ways to do this. How are we going to do this? How are we going to get a pattern for hundreds of developers to follow across hundreds of products? There's actually a much larger audience of this stuff internally than just my division, but that's a different topic. So how are we going to do this, right? And so I'm noodling through. Okay, I can train. I've got an hour to an hour and a half during this conference that I'm speaking at. I can train people on Angular 2. That would be cool. I can dive into specific items that are of difference. I can do all this stuff, but the truth is, I myself don't really know this stuff all that well, right? I started reading ngbook back in the day, switched over to ngbook 2. Ari and Nate have been super, super gracious and letting us do all kinds of good stuff with their stuff, and they've taken feedback too. So
those are awesome books. I got ngbook 1, and then as soon as ngbook 2 came out, like I bought it like as soon as I saw it, and I was so excited. Sam called me.
Me too. We got the preview version, right? And if you remember, there was a very short period of time where Jules was telling everybody, hey, while we're getting our docs up and running, ngbook 2 is kind of the best place for you to go for documentation on Angular 2, which was great. It was pre-packaged, pre-ready to go. Now the documentation site has caught up and is great from a free resource. It's awesome. Very, very, very impressive. So I'm looking at these options in these ways and realized the best way to go about this would be to show an actual migration. How does this work, right? And so from that perspective, it started to flourish into, okay, well, our current patterns today don't use components, right? Our normal pattern, our AngularJS pattern, was stuck somewhere around 1.4.5. So we hadn't adopted components as a standard yet. People were using them, but it wasn't a standard. So that was one step. And then the next step, of course, was migrating the whole thing. And then I realized, okay, well, the concept of ng upgrade is really intriguing, especially for teams that have thousands of pages, right? We've got several teams that have been on a journey, for lack of a better term, for the past 3 years or so to migrate all their products away from ASP.NET, JSP, WinForms, all that stuff, into a modern front-end approach using Angular, specifically AngularJS. So those teams are not going to be able to just turn on a dime and convert all that stuff to Angular in one dev cycle, especially considering they're not even done. They're still going. They have another 6 months or so to go. And this is a large team converting a tremendous amount of source code, some of which have dependencies on ActiveX components, some have Silverlight, which is an ActiveX component, all that good stuff. So the concept of building a series of applications that show a fairly small, easy to digest and easy to understand, but complex enough to show most of the moving pieces of Angular, showing that thing getting migrated up into components and then up into Angular and then into a hybrid had a lot of appeal. I didn't realize what I was biting off when I wrote the thing because I didn't have a ton of time. I only had about 6 weeks to learn and build all this stuff before I had to ship off and start showing it. So so you're going to see lots of things that were discoveries on my part. I was going through the code earlier this week for Denny just to see, oh yeah, I remember that. Oh, I remember that. It was a fond memory, but it was also really, really stressful because there were certain things that I kept earmarking going, all right, I'm gonna have to come back to that. I'm gonna have to come back to that. I'm gonna have to come back to that because I couldn't figure it out and I wanted to keep going. So that's the backstory. That's what this is. Partway through, it started to become apparent to me that I was finding scenarios that just weren't documented or described well on the interwebs, right? The concept of using UI router in an application was very well documented. We use that all over the place. That's what we've standardized on and have for a very long time. Using UI router with a resolver to consume a parameter and do something with it before you invoke the route, that was also fairly well documented. Doing that in TypeScript, not so much. It was just almost like trying to find a unicorn in some cases. So that's one of my more favorite ones. And so I realized I'm not treading new ground here, but I really don't see a lot of examples for this out on the web, right? Stack Overflow, documentation, ngBook, a lot of those things skipped over some of these dark corners that I've painted myself into. So the best thing I could do would be to take this thing and make it consumable for the open source community. I want to give a quick shout out. One of the reasons why I had to create a second copy of this thing is because we actually use a couple of internally developed components. One of them, it's called, the code name is the Bento Toolkit. And that is a customized toolkit that we've created specifically for use within tax and accounting, Thomson Reuters tax and accounting. It involves all of our UX standards. So the UX team, as they evolve our designs, we migrate that into the Bento Toolkit, and as teams pull down newer and newer versions from our internal NPM endpoint, they're automatically getting applied to the product. So CSS changes are easy, component changes can be more challenging, but this is a shared component that lives across all the teams. It's owned and managed by three of my all-time favorite people. That's Aaron Mendez, Chi Gao, and Joe Wong. They live in Hoboken, and that's their primary focus, is to build that thing and make it excellent in quality. So we're about to release an internal version of the Angular 4, or just Angular, Bento Toolkit. So I had to take that out because it's proprietary. And so that was a bit of a challenge to back off some of that stuff. We also use some other third-party components that were licensed. So we backed those off as well. And so what's on the site now, the GitHub site, is a purely open source model that has nothing that you can't get just right off of NPM today. And so that's why I have two versions of this thing, and also why on occasion you'll see this thing kind of go dark for a bit. It's not because I'm not actually living and breathing in it. It's because I'm living and breathing in the internal version that is consumed by 100 or so teams, because they're asking for changes. They're asking for, hey, we want code coverage. Hey, we want to migrate to a new version of this component. The new version of Angular has this. So what I'm doing is keeping that thing alive and breathing, and then over time, taking snapshots of it and retroactively applying it back into ng-rosetta, the live public version. So there's the backstory. Again, interrupt me if you've got questions or anything else. Let's just jump right into some code so we can talk about this thing.
I have a question.
Go.
I thought we were your two favorite people. You said that that other team was like favorite people.
Yeah, you're my two other favorite people. Absolutely.
Yep. So them and us are your top five.
They've figured out how to supply me with potato chips. So as soon as you can figure that out, then we'll be on equal footing. So,
touché.
So just to take a look at this thing, again, it's intentionally low content, right? I want to be able to talk about this thing in the span of an hour. So one application shown 4 different ways. So the application itself is intentionally small, but there's quite a bit of stuff going on inside it. So here's the Angular. This is effectively pre-components, right? So this is still using 1.5. I migrated up from 1.4.5 at the time to do this. I think this is 1.5.8. But I used the standard pattern we already had, using UI router with controller as a view template rather than the component piece. So we log in. We get a grid of fruit. This originally was Batmobiles. It was way more cool when it was Batmobiles, but the site that I was pulling all the images from was this one guy who had, I have 1,000 Batmobiles on there. It was bitching, but I didn't want to release this thing to GitHub and then all of a sudden have his site just get get swamped by people trying to run this thing. So that would be not cool. So we have a series of rows in here. Clicking on a row gets you to a detail page, right? We're using routing to do this. Here we're using a route parameter, right, to supply which version of the thing we want. We have a custom directive here that's rendering not only the image, but also supplies a URL to this thing. So it's a clickable image. So when we click on this thing, it actually takes us out to Wikipedia to see that stuff. So that's about it. There's not a whole lot of moving pieces to this thing. Again, intentionally. So let's go look under the hood and see what it's comprised of and how it was put together. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the old stuff, but in order for us to show how we got to the new stuff, it's important to know where we came from, lest we be doomed to repeat it over and over again. So I used our existing, for this one, this is the 1X version, I used our existing patterns at the time. And again, this is roughly a year ago, using patterns that were created almost 3 years ago, mildly updated, but still fairly old. And they've been updated internally. There's something that I'll talk about towards the end of this. So this thing uses UI router, right? It's a UI router based application. So that's where all our routes and stuff are coming from, which is great. We're using the controller as pattern. So as you can see, right, I'm pulling in controllers, providing it with controller as. The individual components here live in kind of a sloppy implementation. This is not the best implementation. We've got controllers and views occupying each other. The controllers are their own pieces, all that good stuff. It does use Bootstrap. So if you're curious on how to work with Bootstrap and all that stuff, here's a decent example. And then I'm building it with Grunt. So this old version, we used Grunt to manage all our builds. So here's our Grunt file. I'm not going to go into all that stuff because we were able to step away fairly quickly. Grunt served its purpose and worked really well for us for a number of years. We have a bunch of customizations that we apply to our builds. We've done a number of things to support lazy loading our components, our products as components and other applications and frameworks. So all that's worked out really well for us. But I have to say I've been a pretty staunch supporter of Webpack since I learned it, and I learned it in the course of building this. So, and then lastly, we unit test through Karma, right? So I've got a test folder here with the individual unit tests for this thing. So, okay, great. One thing worth calling out, the detail page. So again, we go back to this detail page, if I can find it. There we go. When I click on one of these things, right, as you saw, we route over to the detail piece and we pass in a parameter. That parameter is actually used to make a service call. So if we take a look at the source code for this, I should mention one of the things that I did first was convert this whole thing to TypeScript. So we were not using TypeScript to begin with. Our pattern at the time was and still is JavaScript for the older patterns. Teams are rapidly taking it up. They like it very much. And I've actually got a whole new seed project that I released a month or so ago that uses Webpack and TypeScript for AngularJS. And that's been that's seen widespread adoption because it works really well and it has a lot less moving parts. So I should have called that out. We'll talk through the TypeScript implementation for a bit, but I wanted to call this thing out. So here's our state, right? This is the fruit detail state. And as Denny showed previously, this is the declaration of the fruit item ID parameter. I've got a resolve section in here where we're creating an instance of the fruit factory. And the fruit item parameter, I'm calling a function that will effectively go and get the list of data, right? Since this data is all self-contained, it's all running off of a single local file. I cheated. I wanted to keep this thing completely self-contained. So this doesn't include solid backend patterns. This is purely front-end based. So you're going to see a couple of things in this particular pattern that you shouldn't do, right? For example, don't go get a whole list of stuff, right, from over the web and then slice out just one thing. That's bad. Don't do that, right? Go get the one thing, write your services so that it goes and gets the one thing. For the purpose of example and how to use this, it worked really well, but this is not a good pattern. Nor is, I should say, doing a resolve to call a service during a route transition, right? That's also not necessarily a good thing to do, right? If you're going over the web to go get a bunch of data, doing that during the route resolve means the user is going to see that thing just sit and spin, right? It's just going to churn while it's waiting. That's a poor implementation. Instead, you want to load up the component and then do an on init, right? But again, I wanted to demonstrate some of the harder parts of this stuff. For example, How do you invoke a resolver to go get a service call? It may not be the best pattern, but again, this is really hard. There's hardly any documentation on how to do this. If you're using local storage, if you're using caching or some other mechanism to hold on to stuff, and you want to cache credentials, you want to check credentials in the old stuff before we have all the new flavor route guards, this is where you do that, right? I need to check the credentials that I'm working to make sure they have access to this thing. This is where you do that, and you would certainly do that with an internal service because you'd want to propagate that everywhere. You may not want to go get those credentials every time over the web. So caveats aside, this is how this works. We fire off the fruit item parameter, which returns a function. The function goes and gets the list of items. The list of items is then passed into a utility function that just does an iteration through it. It's just an array, and pulls out the item in question and returns that. So great, okay. So that's the route resolver. That's what the route's doing. How do we consume that? It's different in every version. So in this version, the fruit item parameter is passed in the constructor, right? So we actually specify in this constructor, I need one of these guys. And when we go and do the resolve on this thing, it maps up and we're off and running and it works nicely. Right. So that was fairly easy and straightforward, right? Again, the TypeScript aspect was a little confounding for me at the time, simply because of the volume of stuff coming at me. When we see this again in 1.5, where we're using components, it takes on a whole new life. So a couple of things to talk about what I did to make this thing the good starting point. One was the concept of converting to TypeScript. At the time, I was using TypeScript 1.8, I think. Therefore, I used typings, right? So these are effectively obsolete now. We don't use typings anymore. TypeScript 2 was kind enough to give us the @types type inside NPM, and so that's much better. But here's what they are, right? This is us using typings to do this stuff, and then actually pulling these things in. I ended up creating an index file that was the glue for the entire application. Interestingly enough, that's what the Angular module pattern ultimately became for me. I was able to ditch all this stuff in later versions because the Angular module did all this for me, right? So here, these are basically old style triple hash references that are now replaced with imports, right? But again, I wanted to leave this pristine because this is how we used to do it. And if we used to do it this way, I'm betting a lot of other people used to do it this way or are still doing it this way. And I want to be able to show the contrast and compare of, if you're starting from here, this is where you go. So import in the typings and then import in all the components, right? And then import this file into each of those components so that you have access to it. This pattern was interesting. Again, so notice at the top of the import, the top of the app thing, I'm importing that piece so we have access to all this stuff. Created a pattern for an app config object that does some constructor stuff to build things, defines our states, all that good stuff. But then at the bottom, right, we have the actual Angular module declaration. So here then are all my third-party dependencies. Here's my config where I can set up my state stuff. And then we start creating factories, services. These are instances, right? Passing services in. So that's how you're passing in a component or a dependency into one of these things. The namespacing was fun. That brought me back to the old C# days. So I did everything with a TypeScript module to give it a namespace. And there we go. So again, tested with Karma. I was thinking anything else in here. The router resolve stuff, yeah, I think that's mostly it. So that's the starting point of all this stuff, right? Let's move on to 1.5 and show some of that stuff. I don't need to spend nearly as much time on this one because it's pretty much just straight port, right?
It's so nostalgic.
Isn't it? Isn't it? I know, I agree. And it's been fascinating to bounce across. And like I said, we've got hundreds of projects, and I get to help with all of them. So I'm constantly bouncing back and forth between Angular 4 stuff and AngularJS stuff and different flavors of AngularJS, depending on when the team broke ground and started with the pattern. So this then is the same application, though migrated to Webpack. So that was interesting. That was one of the first things I did. First upgraded to Angular 1.5, 1.5.8, converted to TypeScript 2. So the typings then go away, right? And we now are using our types, which is very nice. right? Really enjoyed that. By the way, I just discovered this project is broke. It looks like I did something, I think, with coverage while I was adding coverage in. The build breaks, but the code still works. So it's basically a typing issue with TypeScript. I'm not sure what happened, but translate and UI router seem to have been dropped off of the build process, even though they're still brought in. So the compiler doesn't like them, but it still brings them in and packages them, which means it runs same way as before, right? This is the exact same application, though now running in Angular 1.5 using Angular 1.5 components, right? If I opened up the debugger, you'd see a million errors saying, I can't find angular.ui. What the hell are you talking about? So let's see, just a couple of things worth talking about. If we go look at the actual components, so the project structure changes slightly, right? Here's our component, right? And this is a standard AngularJS component, right? So we've got classes, we've got controllers, we've got all that stuff. We've got our declaration of controller and controller as. This one doesn't have very much logic in it, and that's good. Another thing that I really appreciated about switching to components was the ability to use the component property in state. Note that this was not available when I started. I think this was like 0.83, something to that effect. And the way UI router worked before that, the only thing you could specify was templates, right? So you'd give it a template URL. Something.html, right? And then you'd give it your controller. Okay, so that's great. Well, we didn't want to do that, right? We want to use components. So if I use a template itself instead of doing the router, I could do this.
I remember I was really excited when they had that, when they added that functionality in the router, because
right?
it was, because when we switched over to the component, then there was more functionality that we could do that we weren't able to do.
Exactly. So this is how I was cheating in the first version of this thing. If you go back and look in the history, you'll see this, right? Component didn't exist. In fact, at one point, Stephen Fluin was like, "Why aren't you using component?" And I said, "Oh, I didn't know they added that. I'll go do that." And it wasn't there. And the reason why was because the Bower version was out of date compared to the NPM version. So NPM had 1.0, but Bower didn't. So I was pulling down newer versions from Bower. It didn't exist. I'm like, oh crap, they must have deprecated it, and that's it. That's the end, and I can't use that because we're dependent on Bower for some of our other components, and I can't do that. Shifting over to NPM, which was something we were able to do once we started migrating things into BAMs and local NPM, allowed us to upgrade to the newer versions. And I've realized since then that even the Bower versions have been updated so that this is now available. The component piece is now available in both ecosystems. So use it because it's awesome. This is much easier. So that's great, except for when we come to this resolve piece. So now let's take a look at this friggin' resolve thing. We're going to do a component, right? We're going to declare a bindings here in the route resolver, right? So we have our component and we have our bindings. Now we're going to resolve, and in the resolve, right, we're using a standard TypeScript function. We're going to instantiate a couple of things inside the function here. We're going to pull this thing out and then go get it. So this looks exactly the same. This looks slightly different, and this looked totally different. What the heck? And if we go look at the actual detail piece, right, this is the concept of binding for a component. So this is how you pass data into an AngularJS component, right? You use the bindings property. It's a public property. You're going to pass in stuff that you want. It'll declare it here, and then you can use it internally. That's perfectly fine. Here's my current fruit item, right? And we declare that and pull it in, and it works perfectly fine. So great. But again, this was totally different, right? All of my syntax blue, and I've got a bunch of notes in here describing this is why this is like this. This is different now. It's changed, and all the rest of the good stuff. Interestingly, this automatically becomes a property on the controller, right? By doing this, so the controller itself has no knowledge of this whatsoever, right? We don't declare it, we don't instantiate it, we don't do anything with it. And yet, that's what our view is using across the board, right? It's using the current control item. I'm sorry, current fruit item. And the reason why is because bindings creates this item on the controller. So it actually just plops it on there, without this thing even being aware of it. That was an interesting discovery. It works. It makes perfect sense why it would do that. And again, this is a nice pattern to go and get something that your controller needs when you're changing it, right? So again, I would probably move this logic into the controller so that the controller itself is invoking this on init. But I wanted to show what this looks like because it's hard. If it's hard, we definitely want to do it. So, and again, this is what this looks like, right? So that's what that parameter does. That parameter goes through the route resolver, right? And then we can watch it get applied to the bindings when it comes back, and off we go. What else? Webpack. Oh, lots of learning about code splitting, CSS support, HTML processing. Created a bunch of entry-level scripts. I have to say, I just became enamored with this whole concept where instead of spelunking through the grunt file to figure out what the aliases were, all your scripts are right here, right? And I was able to really start diving into what Webpack does by using some of this stuff. One of the most important pieces to this was the usage of AOT, so the ahead-of-time compilation stuff in Angular 2. That, of course, doesn't exist in AngularJS, so we don't have that. But I still wanted to apply minification and a couple other things, too. So I've got two scripts here. Start just fires off the Webpack dev server and feeds it the config file. Dev and prod both delete their prior instances, feed the same config file, right? I only have one web config file. That was Webpack config file. That was a big push for me. I really didn't want to have 5 config files floating around because I kept seeing that pattern, and I made it myself, and then I started getting confused.
I went through this, and it's like deja vu looking at this because I went through this. I was trying to do Webpack into an Angular 1.5 project,
Yep.
and it was painful because I didn't really know Webpack that well, and there wasn't really a whole lot out there. And and I got it working, and it was beautiful. But the actual process to get it working, it was funny because Denny and I had lunch like that week, right? Like either during or right after I got it working, and I was like, man. So number one, you got to use Webpack because it's really cool. But number two, it's really hard to get that first config file.
Yeah.
And I'm reading this, and then right after that, I started using the Angular CLI, and I was just like, woohoo! So
yeah,
now I can use Webpack without writing that.
That's an interesting comment. So. This is fairly bread and butter, right? This is invoking Webpack. By the way, the CLI is too, right? The CLI is using Webpack under the hood. If you scaffold a new project using the CLI and then do an ng eject on it, it will output everything that it's got internally in the CLI config file into a properly formatted web config file, right? So that's great.
What happened was this guy, the guy that introduced me to Webpack told me he said, I was asking him for help with the config file, and he said, just go and copy and paste one off the internet, and they're basically, they're pretty. I mean, it's pretty standard, right? The Webpack config file, you can usually just copy one. And I was like, no, because I don't want to put anything in my project that I don't understand, and I want to like go through each line and write it. So it took me days. It took me like probably 4 or 5 days to get everything working. And when I finished all of that, I had the same config file that I started with that I would have copy pasted from the internet.
Right, but you earned it at that point.
But I understood all of it and knew what it did, so it was worth the week. But it was, So don't be like me. Just copy and paste it, or just do the CLI and then
or find a good reference that explains what the hell's going on. That was the hardest thing for me, and again, that's why I've created.
There was nothing back then. What I had back then was Sean Larkin and Joshua Weens on Twitter. They helped me, and they actually did help me. They were kind of amazing.
Sure they did. Yeah, those guys are prolific and very, very helpful, and they're very passionate about their products. So it's always in their best interest to get people on board. And I've been a convert for quite a while and a big fan of theirs too.
Yeah, they're awesome.
So with the advent of Webpack 2. We're up to Webpack 3 now, actually. But in Webpack 2, they introduced this concept of the environment object. Made things so much easier. Again, the difference between these two is one of them just invokes the config file as normal with some parameters in terms of how to display stuff. This one is exactly the same, but it introduces the production environment variable. That's it, right? That's it. That's the only difference between these two. And then, of course, we've got testing. The difference in the web config file, I'm harkening back to my old ASP.NET days. Webpack config, it's interesting if you think about it. I mean, we're used to writing this thing as a configuration file, so we're defining these configuration items in here. But really, what you're doing is you're simply declaring a static object, right? There's nothing else to it. You're just making an object, and that's it, with an underlying object model underneath the hood. So when you think of it like that, things start to change, right? So notice all the green in here, right? These are all heavily described. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Webpack in here. They're way better references and documentation than mine, but I did take pains to describe what's going on in each of these things to help people figure out what this is, and myself as well as I go back. So notice I'm not, I've got my entry points, I've got the extensions defined, but my rules don't include anything for minification or anything. And the reason why is because down here below, I've got this if statement. In the if statement, yeah. So the if statement specifies if I sent in the environment production flag, then do this, right? So start changing that object. I declared the object up above. Now start to change it, right? Change the output to this folder, right? And change some of the chunking mechanisms this way. Add a couple of extra plugins, right? The uglify, so we can minify the crap out of the thing. I love this flag. That just kills me. That's not mine. That was already there. So if you're not using IE8, then great. You can go much, much deeper. If you are using IE8, you can't do some of the things that...
Is that in the Webpack config? Who did? I bet you Joshua wrote that.
It is. It's awesome. I love that. Every time I see this and every time I show this, everybody starts cracking up going, yeah, yeah.
It had to. I'm going to have to ask him about that. Screw IE8. I bet he wrote that.
Hey, and IE8 was amazeballs in its day, but we've progressed and there's back, right? So this is production, right? So production basically says, output your files here and minify them, right? Not production is dev, which means if you're not production, then go ahead and smack a source map on there, right? Because I want to see my source, and change your output to the dev folder, and that's it, right? So that's how I was able to do all this stuff with one Webpack config. We just have a nice little clean if statement. Now we're going to go look at this again in the Angular 4 stuff, and it's way more prolific. But it works pretty well. And the end result is we have this nice clean distribution folder, right? This has tons of web fonts and stuff in it from Bootstrap, but our data and our translation files are in there, and the CSS is in there, and that's good. And the prod stuff doesn't have the map files, and the JS files are greatly minified, so they're much, much smaller. I also found a gzip plugin. I'll show that later. It just creates gzipped versions of your source code during output. And the value in that is not necessarily that you're going to ship that, right? Ideally, you want to use your web server to gzip those things on the way out so that you've got something manageable on the server and let it do its job. You can, of course, you can always pre-gzip them, right, and then ship them that way. But what I liked was it gives me the ability to actually compare the values, the size of these things coming out. So on my distribution folder, I can see the minified version of the files and the gzipped versions of those minified versions. And on average, they end up being roughly 1/10 the size of the dev files, which is awesome. That's a really cool thing. Okay, let's see. Code splitting, talked about minification. I use live server for a lot of this stuff. So here, check it out. If we go into one of these folders, so I'm going to do fruit15, and I'm going to move into the prod folder. Right, so this is what happens when I do this. If I do from the root, if I do npm run build prod, right, it will delete that folder, rerun everything, and then create it, and that's great. So I've got a command line in this folder. Live server is such a wonderful tool. So live server is an npm plugin, and you want to install it in the global space. So you do npm install live-server-g, right? So now that I'm in here, it just runs a lightweight server right from the directory that I'm sitting in. Right, so I just launched the contents of this folder, right, in a lightweight web server. So here I can just test what comes out of the prod piece right then and there, right? I can see performance stuff, right? So if I actually want to see this stuff go, right, there we go. I can see this thing start loading up. I can see the source code. I can debug it, right? That's always fun. I can see what's putting in here. Oh, it didn't like something. That's funny. I broke it. It did something bad. But when it's working correctly, using a live server to debug your output is really cool. So I highly recommend it. Let's see. Is choice. Oh, it won't let me out. There we go. Okay. I'll get rid of that one. So see, using a live server, I talked about that. Got rid of the controller as to use components. Modified the states. We talked about rendering and the router resolve pattern. So we talked about that. Okay, so I think that's about it for the 1.5 stuff, and we'll ship off to the 2.0 stuff. So then here, we'll just collapse this away. Here's the full version of the Fruit 2.0 application. Hopefully by now the naming convention is starting to stick. I started to move away from the naming convention, but it turned out I kind of liked it. So it's the Fruit application. There's a 1.x version of it, right? There's a 1.5 version of it. There's a, there's a 2.0 version of it that was Angular 2, right? And yeah, I can make 4 and 5 and whatever. I'm probably not going to. And then there's the hybrid, which is a 2.0 1.5, right? And that's why all that stuff is. So Fruit 2.0 1.5 is an ng upgrade version that took the raw Fruit 1.5 source code. I just took everything in this thing, dumped it into a legacy folder, right? So there's all the Fruit 1.5 stuff, and referenced it inside a standard Angular 4 application using ng upgrade, right? So here's the upgrade module, and I know you guys already talked about this last week. That was the episode I was unable to attend, so my apologies on that. But there you go. There's a live example of that all working, and we can talk about that too at some point if we feel like it. But for now, let's go trace into this one. So a couple of changes to make this work. So this is a completely new version of this thing using proper patterns, right? So now we go look at that home component again, right? We can see it's much more lightweight. Again, lots and lots of comments in here, so please feel free to pull this down if you're confused about something or how something works. I, again, went to great pains to comment the bejesus out of this thing because I wanted to make sure that it made sense. So we're doing our normal standard imports, right? We're pulling in the necessary pieces. We've got a component, we've got a selector, we've got a template for that. Fairly straightforward properties here, and then we're just doing a route navigate, right, on click of this. So here's the HTML for that. Lots and lots of Bootstrap, right? We did lots of Bootstrap to get this to look real good, right? So it looks real good. We're using proper layout and all that good stuff. Bindings in there. We click the button, right? It launches the router and changes us from home to fruit list, right? The fruit list component now, same type of thing. I've got some references in here, pulling in some stuff. Again, we've got an event in here. So the first one, this is the proper pattern. You want to do this internally. So on init of this component, then I fire the get data, right? So that way I can use a spinner or something else to indicate that the component is loading, but it's busy. That's a much nicer and cleaner pattern to use when you go do data manipulation. So that goes and gets our stuff. This runs really, really quickly. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder what's going on with that.
This is what happens when you live code.
Invoke the Lord's demo. I do it all the time. That's fascinating. I'm not sure why it's doing that, but I wanted to do so. We have a hyperlink right here to launch into the article, right? Clicking on the row loads up the thing too. Again, here's a custom directive, right, which we converted to a component that consumes the image URL and the target URL and then renders the image in line as the clickable element. Binding and all that good stuff. Yeah, now it works. That's weird. Anyway, so fruit list invokes the data. You're not seeing this because it's running really quickly. I should put a wait or a timeout in here. I had one at one point. I must have removed it. But I do have a spinner that shows, oh, you know what? I don't. It's because that's the internal version. My apologies. In any case, we go get some data. Let's go look at the services in this thing. I wanted to call out something screwy. So my service, right, lives here. And I really, really did not want to force my teams to learn RxJS at the same time that they were learning all the rest of this stuff, right? So they're learning TypeScript, Webpack, Angular 2 at the time, all the idiosyncrasies and component patterns and module patterns. And I just felt that adding RxJS on top of that was a bit cruel. I get it, and it makes sense, and I had the ability to sit and take the time to read through the 2 chapters in MG book that are really good. But with this thing, it just felt cruel. And I also discovered that one of the vendor pieces we had didn't work with output from an observable. And the reason why was because I wasn't aware of the async flag to apply at the binding. level. So we'll come back to that in a second. I still don't have it. Instead, what I did was I imported the toPromise operator. And so when I'm doing normal HTTP calls, this is a standard HTTP GET. At the end of the GET, right, at the result of this, I do a toPromise, right? So that converts the observable to a promise. Not ideal, right, in most cases, but for a learning perspective, it works really well. So that puts us back in our familiar territory of using then and catch. So for teams that are used to using then and catch, or success and fail in the old versions, this feels a lot more comfortable, and you can get up and running much more quickly with this. Excuse me, over time, using the actual RX versions are better. So here's the observable version, right? Just taking the item and then doing a map on it on the data. And that works perfectly fine. Problem, again, was that the control I was using was missing the ability to work with that. And I think the control itself was probably fine. It was that I didn't realize that I needed to apply an async parameter to the binding. So I'll be going
when you guys say this, because it always sounds so casual when you're going. You and Denny and Sam was doing that too. You just go, oh yeah, I had to figure this out. I had to do that, and I'm like, you guys make it sounds so nonchalant, but I bet it took because when I get stuck on stuff like that, it takes forever.
Oh yeah, this took forever. Like I said, I had 6 weeks to build all 4 of these, right, on top of my day job. So I was absolutely sweating bullets towards the last week or two. Remember, I had to get on a plane and get in front of 100 or 200 people and show this and walk them through it. So it damn well better work.
I remember when I first started with Angular, I actually convinced my department at Conoco to start using Angular, and I started building this stuff with Angular. And then every once in a while I would get stuck. And they're like, Bonnie, what are you going to do? And I'm like, well, that's why I started the NG Houston. I was looking for somebody smarter than me so they could help me when I get stuck. And and back then there was not like,
yeah, trust me, I understand. I live on the bleeding edge all the time. I
laugh every time you guys say
really, I enjoy this very much, but yeah, I certainly don't mean to pass over the fact that this took time and effort to find this stuff. Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm just glad it was your time and effort and not ours. Now we can just benefit.
And honestly, that's part of the shtick with this role that I'm playing. So it was my time and effort and not a whole bunch of different teams trying to figure this out all at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So all the teams are able to just pull this stuff off the shelf and go, okay, this is how we do this. And again, we're doing it with internal tools and other stuff too, so it makes it that much better.
And it's really cool to see the side by side. This is what it looks like. That's what I liked about Denny's series the first time was this is what it looks like in the old Angular, and this is what it looks like in the new Angular. And it's good to have that reference when you're trying to figure this out.
Right.
I love this.
Yeah, it is. That was the whole point. And again, I kept finding stuff. I kept finding I want to do this. I know what I want to do, but I can't find an example of it to get the syntax correct. And honestly, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to publish this. Actually, I had to ask permission to do this, right? Working for a big giant company, they don't like it when you give stuff away. But we have a really good open source governance crew that's headed by just a really, really good, solid guy who's very pro open source. So consuming and giving back to the open source community has become a fairly big thing for us, right? Nobody wants to just sit here and take. We actually enjoy giving this back, and my time today to do this stuff. This is the good stuff, right? This is how we get all this stuff to be better. So it's not just big corporations trying to get away with something. There is an aspect of I love helping people do this stuff, and the fact that I was able to give this back to everybody just meant that I was able to use all that effort that I applied to my teams internally and give it to the rest of the open source community. So
it's and maybe it's just for me. It seems like a new thing in the last couple of years because I've just started getting involved with the Angular community probably since I started using Angular and started going to ng-conf. I've started being more involved in the open source community, and with the exception of my immediate family, I've seriously met some of my favorite people in this community. It's just amazing.
Yeah, I agree, and it seems to attract a lot of talent. You don't have anybody else to ask.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Look, there isn't anybody else. It's you. It's open source. Go figure it out. And that's not true at all. There's Stack Overflow. There's tons of experts. There are people that get paid to do this. There's people that do it just out of the goodness of their heart. There's all kinds of people in between. So that's one of the best things about this. So, okay, so let's see. Just to go over a handful of things in here, I wanted to talk about the service thing here. So this is a standard service, right, with a handful of methods, and all that's perfectly fine. And again, we're using the parameter approach. We're passing in a parameter to go get this thing. But I wanted to call out something that seems to have disappeared. So this thing, I don't know if you guys remember this. This was part of the Angular tutorial back a year ago, right? So when you went through the tutorial and we're going through the services part, they actually had you use this, right? And it's brilliant. It's really cool. It's a third-party component. Looks like this, right? So I know this is out of date by at least a few minor versions. But you add this thing in your product, right? Or into your project, and then you create a file that imports it, and then you create something that extends from it. And lo and behold, you're basically creating an in-memory database full of whatever it is that you feed it. So in this case, I followed the pattern that they had up on the Angular tutorial. This was the hero database at the time, right? This is now my fruit stuff. So in the older versions of fruit, if we go back to fruit 1.5.
I have never seen that, David.
I know, and I went back and looked, and it's gone.
It's
so.
Where did you? It was there, and then that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So check it out.
Offline browsing.
Right. So here's just a faux data source, right? This is a JSON data file, right? It just pulls stuff in. These are hard-coded static stuff. So when you're making your service call, find it. There we go. So when you make your service call, hey. Oh, that's right. So again, this is the old stuff where we had stuff bundled together weirdly. So this is bundling the service thing together because this is the component that used it. So here, right? Build this string and then go get it, right? That's it. That's the end. There's nothing else. That's all there is to go get this thing. That's how you go get your data. And that's great. This thing, this was bitchin'. This is really cool. I can specify this thing because of the way it works. It defaults to app. So if we go look at the, where is it here? If I go look at my app module where I declare this thing, right? So we're importing the actual library, right? And then we're importing my implementation of that thing, right? And then on the imports, we're declaring an instance of this thing, creating the for root piece, so we're feeding it top level stuff, passing in my library, right? So that's the file I just created that has that fruit database in it. And then a configuration parameter to let us pull this. And the cool thing about this is, once you do that, your services can target this URL. And it works great. So this is how I'm pulling my data. I have an in-memory database server, effectively just showing, all it's doing is caching in memory an array of objects, right? And so when I go and get the list, right, we go and get that URL, which is equal to app.fruit or app/fruit. Right, that's where it lives. If I had created another table, it would be app/the other table name, right? So it's very simple to use and invoke. Go and get that thing, right? Do a toPromise, and then shoot it back out, right? Response.json data, right? There you go. No fuss, no muss. Very simple, very straightforward. The interesting thing is you can actually apply a parameter to it. So this effectively invokes a query. So by passing in the ID that I've stipulated coming in here, the in-memory database will search for the appropriate thing and just return the one item, right? So this is effectively mocking a real backend API, where I would make a call for a whole list of data, or I would make a call for just a specific item that I'd pass an ID to. This allowed me to serve both and have the service be a little bit more smart about how it does stuff. So the item one does not go get the entire list like we did with the old stuff and then pass it into a utility that would scrape the payload looking for the item in question to return just that. This is much more clean and much more representative of how you would work with a real service, a proper backend API. So that was pretty cool. I had this, where is it? I had the page up just so I could show, oh, sorry, not that page, this page. So this is what it looks like now, right? So you create a TypeScript file, right, called mock heroes. You import the object model, and then you export, right, an array of heroes. And then when you go to consume that, you pull it in here, right? And the get heroes service returns that object that's actually brought in from the file system. So they're not doing any HTTP calls at all in this instant, right? They're even less authentic, but again, totally portable, and it makes it really, really clear what's going on from the service perspective. It can be frustrating when you're trying to describe to new learners the concept of an Angular service versus an HTTP service call, right? Which would, in many cases, will invoke a web service. That's 3 services, too many for this. So in this case, they were able to get away with just showing that. But this is where it used to live. I swear, I didn't make it up. This is in the documentation in the tutorial for services. This is where the in-memory database thing used to reside. So I left it in there because I kind of dig it. I will say I just learned, or at least I'm working with a good friend to help modernize some of this stuff from the reference application perspective. And I had him introduce the HTTP client, the newly introduced HTTP client that's coming in. It came in 4, and HTTP is going to be deprecated in 5. You want to use that because it's lighter, makes more sense, cleaner. And that thing doesn't appear to work with the in-memory database API. So that's what he discovered today. I don't know if that's not certified. That's what he discovered, and he sent me an article on why. So I didn't read the article, so it might be that there are ways to get around using that. But interesting to note, Angular 5 may not work with this particular library. Instead, you want to use something else, and that's okay too. But the concept, again, fairly sound, especially for learning application. Having the ability to actually represent a service type approach and call that was pretty cool. So let's just take this all the way down. Let's go back into our route, right? So here's our routing. Now we're using ng-route, right? So before I was using UI router, now I'm using the baked-in Angular router, right? I'm not using the UI router anymore. I'm using the baked-in Angular 4 router. So if we take a look at the routes, right? We're defining a set of routes, right? Path mapped to component, very clean, very straightforward. If we go look at our module, we consume that by just consuming the file, right? And the file itself declares, here's my constant, here are my app routes, right? And at the end, I declare a router module for root, right? So just consuming this file does all the heavy lifting for us. We're good to go. Something to call out, there's 2 cool things in here. One of them is the ability to invoke the resolver, right? So again, propagating that same pattern of how do I go get something during my route transition, and then feed it into the resulting component. How do I do that? So that's this. But the other one is the invocation of the lazy loader, right? So the lazy loader is just absolutely brilliant. And we'll come back and talk about this in a second. And you guys let me know if I'm traipsing close to the end of time. If we're running out of time, just let me know. Because I've still got quite a bit to go over. Anyway, so if we look at the resolver, this is a separate file, right? Very clean, very compartmentalized. The resolver implements resolve of the type of item that we want, right? And in this case, this is really nice. We instantiate the fruit service, right? On our resolved method, which comes from here, right? We pass in the active route snapshot, so effectively a copy of the current route, and then the router itself, right? So we have the route and the state, and we're going to return a promise. We're then going to go get the fruit item, right? Just like that. Right? Really simple, really straightforward. So what the heck does that do? I'll show you. So this is the resolver. And the resolver basically says, I'm getting called in context of a route. Here's the route that's being worked on. And here's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to return this object. And that's great. Right? So we go back and look at the actual route. The actual route then takes the resolver, right? And gives us our fruit detail resolver. Right? So we map the fruit detail resolver to a fruit item object, and the fruit detail resolver is right here. Right? So on the surface, it seems more complicated, but actually it's compartmentalized the various things that are all happening into separate components entirely, which in my opinion, this is absolutely beautiful. So again, to use a resolver, you have to implement the resolve interface, and that basically gives you a resolve feature that has the ability to manipulate, pull stuff off as you need, right? Here I'm pulling the route parameters off of the route, right, to go get this thing. So this is really clean. We then take the result of that thing and map it to something called fruit item. Okay, so again, that's great. And so here's our parameter, right? We talked about that. So if we go look at how that's consumed by the component, right? This is really cool. This is the detail component, and we're pulling in the activated route, right? And we've got our selector, we've got our template, we've got our declaration of a current fruit item for binding purposes. We have a constructor, right, that passes in an instance of the activated route, right? And then on init, I actually pull the value out of the snapshot data, which is effectively an enhanced version of a route parameter. So I like this much better. So instead of in Fruit 1.5, when we were passing the resulting object into the bindings property on the component, right? We had a fruit item shaped socket in our component, and the router allowed us to plug that in once it went and got it. This just simply lets me apply this to the route. Okay, I put something on the route. The component then doesn't need any kind of interface to work with this. It doesn't need to know that that's coming in from a binding perspective. I don't need to do any kind of plumbing on the interface of this thing to get it to work. I simply need to inspect the route that's coming in, right? And again, we're bringing the route in by creating an instance of the activated route, right? The activated route is it's basically a singleton, right? So within the routing engine, there's only one active route. Here it is. Pull the snapshot data off. So it's a much cleaner way to pass it over. You could argue, okay, well, this isn't quite as type safe because I declared stuff. And yeah, you're right. We're using a data array instead. But again, this is just a normal component, and I'm going to inspect the route that loaded me and pull something off. So much tighter integration between the component and the routes, which for me, I like that. But also, I didn't have to change a whole lot on the operation to make it work. Instead, I'm just pulling something out of the infrastructure that loaded me in the first place. And again, I like that much better. So it does exactly the same thing in all 4 applications, but it does it totally differently in 3 of them. The hybrid app just uses the 1.5 version. So let's see. Let's talk about AOT. So this thing supports an AOT build, right? And the first time I did this, I'm going to load up the Wayback Machine. So 7 months ago, I checked in a version of this thing that had, oh shoot, did I lose it? There we go. So it had a TS config for AOT step 1, and then AOT step 2, and then I had a roll-up configuration, and then I had another TS config, the ES5 config. Okay, that's crazy talk, but that's what it was. That's what it took to do an AOT build back with this first version of this stuff. So what you were effectively doing to walk through this thing was you were taking your main TS file, right, the first time through, and running, oh, look, I'm missing a semicolon. See that finger or something. So you're running this thing through the AOT engine, right? And it would just take your application and dump out into a directory someplace, and that someplace actually ends up being the gen directory right here, right? So you need to add this extra parameter to TS config and tell the AOT engine where to put this thing, right? So you'd stick this thing here, and you'd load up this thing, and it would output your source code compiled for AOT, which would create a whole bunch of ng factories, right? So all the TypeScript code that you have today, each of them would turn into a TS factory or an ng factory. And the purpose of that was it effectively created a metadata version of your source code so that the metadata could be inspected by the compiler to see what was actually being used and what wasn't being used. So really nice. So that was the first pass. Second pass would then consume the AOT version, right? So exactly the same file, except that when you're passing stuff in, instead of pulling in app.module.ts, you're passing in the AOT-ified version of that. That's the metadata inspectable version of the file that ended with ng factory, right?
So let me get this straight. You got the ahead of time compilation, which is a brand new feature that wasn't available back then, and you got that working with your AngularJS?
No. Sorry, it wasn't AngularJS. This is Angular 2. So 7 months ago.
Okay, so so now everything has been ported up. You're not still pulling in your older.
Well, we're all using the Webpack plugin now.
Yeah.
Right.
But I mean, are you saying you still have, because you got the app.module stuff? Do you still have some of your stuff that's still AngularJS that's coming into this, or everything's been migrated now?
In this project, the Fruit 2.0, everything has been migrated.
Gotcha.
Okay. However, it is worth noting, right? So your question is basically, did you get AOT to work with AngularJS? And the answer is no. No, it doesn't work that way, right? It can't. The compiler is an Angular compiler. So at the time, I was using the Angular 2 compiler, right?
That's what I was thinking. Like, you have to come up to Angular 2 or Angular, the newer Angular, right? Because some of these features you just can't. It's not available. So
but it's worth calling out from a hybrid perspective. You can still invoke AOT, and I did. So the hybrid application here uses AOT, right, to compile down to minimize and optimize the Angular 4 layer of this hybrid application. So everything that's been written.
Get it working.
What's that?
You did get AOT working with some of the older AngularJS code.
I got AOT working with Angular 4 hosting an AngularJS module. So the AngularJS stuff is totally unaffected by this. It ignores it entirely. Right? As you'd expect. It's designed to work with Angular.
But it's bootstrapped through the newer one.
Yes, that's correct. So if we look at this thing.
I mean, it's a great solution for, I mean, I know this stuff is really tricky. That's why I keep making all these comments, because you guys make it look so easy. But it is really worth looking at this stuff, because there's, I mean, if you have, 20,000 lines of legacy code and you really want these new features, and it just feels like it's so far away.
Right.
But if you get the hybrid going, then you can actually have the newer features without, even if you're not finished.
You can, but again, the concept of the advanced compilation only works on the newer version of the source code. So if you look at what's happening here, this is the AOT configuration file for the hybrid. And this guy calls out to the ng factory version of my Angular 4 app module, right? So that's bringing in stuff the way you'd expect it to. And then down below, it just works as normal to get stuff going in the AngularJS world, right? So this is a true hybrid.
So can we talk about this for a second, just because I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it and make sure that I understand it. Sure. Because the AOT stuff, I mean, I think that it's very, very cool. I haven't directly worked with a lot of it, because some of that stuff is, it just happens, right? Especially with the newer versions of Angular, like we're getting closer and closer. It's like the CLI where I'm using it and I know I'm using it, but I didn't actually have to do anything, right? Which I love.
Right.
So when you say it's not possible, like with the AngularJS, if you have this AngularJS code, you can't use ahead of time compilation. Can you expand on that just a little bit? I know you're already running over and you have more to talk about, but just for a second.
No worries. So here is the output of the build process for the hybrid application, right? So I've got some scale graphics, I've got some web fonts. This is all from Bootstrap, right? I've got my map files. This is really the meat of the application, right? So if we look at the meat of the application, the app file is Angular 4 source code, right? The fruit15 file is the legacy AngularJS source code, right? They're compiled into two separate bundles, right? Because they're effectively using two different compilers, if you think about it. But that's how it works, right? So we want all this stuff in one piece. The vendor file also separate, right? Because this is Angular versus AngularJS. So that's how that works. And that's fine. If we go look at, so this is the unminified and unoptimized version. If I go into the prod version, right, we will see, right, the app file, right, is now actually a somewhat larger, right? The AOT process made that file bigger. Why did it make it bigger? Anybody?
Because it's already got all the views and everything rendered.
Correct. It's pre-compiled, right? So what it does is it takes all your HTML and it pre-compiles it, right? And the pre-compiled version means if you've got a component, right, let's say component A, and that references component B, on the HTML version of component A, you're just going to have a simple reference that says open tag component B, close tag component B, right? When AOT runs, it will take all the HTML source code that's in component B and inject it where the component B reference tag is in component A, right? So if you had a bunch of divs and buttons and forms and stuff, you wouldn't see any of that stuff on component A. You would just see a tag reference for it, right? But when AOT goes and runs its compilations piece, it takes the HTML out of component B and pushes it into component A. And therefore makes the HTML code for component A's template much bigger, right? Now do that repeated over and over again every time you've referenced component B, right? And your HTML entry point is going to grow because you're duplicating that source code everywhere. Why? Because you're getting rid of the compilation engine that runs on that thing. So if we do a side-by-side comparison of this, look at the vendor file, right? This is 873K here. 2.5 megs there, right? And why? Why is it so much bigger? Well, partially because we're minifying, but also partially because the AOT build is stripping out aspects of the Angular engine that you don't need. So it jettisons the compilation engine entirely. The dynamic compilation engine from Angular is jettisoned during the AOT process, right? So that's why you want your templates to be pre-compiled, and pre-compiled means they're bigger if you did the right thing and reuse stuff. So yes, we ended up with a larger file here. We went from 3K to 4K, but it allowed us to go from 200 or 2.5 megs down to 800K, right? So a little bit of growth here for a lot of savings here. Okay. Yes. And then we minified all the rest of this stuff too. So back to this and the original question. This effectively draws a big circle around the AngularJS code and loads it normally. It does not apply the AOT compilation process to it. It stays pristine, right? Because it can't work with it. Angular 2 compiler doesn't work with AngularJS source code, right? There is an initiative. Somebody dug this out of one of the changelogs in GitHub for a potential reversal of that, where it might be able to do some advanced compilation stuff. You know what? I said that, and as I'm saying it, I'm realizing I think it was the opposite. It was an ng upgrade that allowed you to do the other thing around. So instead of hosting an AngularJS application in Angular, which is what we do today, and that's what's showing here, it was the concept of the other way around, of hosting an Angular application or Angular components inside an AngularJS application. That was a pipe dream, maybe kind of sort of thing that somebody dug out of a design piece somewhere. Will it happen? I don't know. If the team were on it, we could totally ask them, but that's okay. In any case, this is the strategy to do this. So back to the AOT stuff. So again, looking at this, I had, so the first pass compiles this thing, right? The second pass compiles the now pre-formatted versions of this, which dumps it way down, right? That drops out all the Angular stuff. It pre-compiles, it does everything else. And it results in a massive block of JavaScript files, right? I say massive. It's an unaffected version of JavaScript stuff. So after that, you want to do proper tree shaking on that. And so in order to do that, at the time, I used Rollup, right? That was the recommended pattern. So Rollup is a third-party plugin, Rollup.js. It's in here somewhere. So step 3 was to run Rollup over the resulting JavaScript that came out of the second AOT pass. And interestingly enough, so that worked great, right? And it did tree shaking, right? And the end result of that was it dropped a whole bunch of packages out of that because they were discovered to be not necessary. And then the last piece of that was that the resulting JavaScript that came out of the Rollup compiler was formatted for CommonJS. It wasn't usable inside a browser. So I actually had to run TypeScript a fourth time, or I should say run a fourth step that invoked TypeScript to just pull in the bundle JavaScript that came out of the Rollup. I turned on allow.js and targeted ES5. And so what this did was take the bundled Rollup version and strip out all the incompatibilities, format it for ES5, and then drop it here. And final.js became the actual output for AOT. So again, those are the old days. That was painful. It sucked. It was not well documented. It worked really well when you got it turned on. It was the coolest thing. The first time I saw the output of that thing and saw that the source code had shrunk by like an order of 5, that was just awesome. But it took me quite a while to get there. And it was difficult to train people on and show them how to do this. So of course, I had this all packaged into a single script, right? So they would run build prod, and it would invoke all of these different things through subscripts. Way painful, right? So don't do that anymore. Now, today we have this guy, right? So this just makes your world so much better, right? This includes the plugin and the loader for TypeScript to invoke all this stuff. So if we go look at the Webpack now, right, this is basically the same Webpack, but it's grown a bit to accommodate a couple other things. If we go look at the if block for production, right? So here's our if block, just like before. I swap out the entry point, right, for Webpack to start with the AOT file, right, and then give it the AOT plugin, right? The AOT plugin basically does all this stuff for me in combination with the ng-tools Webpack loader, right? So instead of using TypeScript loader, like we are for the dev build, we're using ng-tools Webpack as the loader, right? And those two things in combination do all that work that I just described in memory under the hood, right? Which is why, if you've ever wondered, hey, I'm trying to do this AOT stuff, and I've got it working, but I had to create this file that looks just like this file, except I had to change this thing. And again, I don't know what's up with that. I had to change this thing from, instead of app.module, I had to change it to app.module ng-factory, and I had to give it this weird path. What gives? Because that path doesn't exist, and this file doesn't exist, and my editor and my build stuff is barking at me saying this thing doesn't exist. What gives, right? And so the reason why, like I said, is that this file is actually generated on the first pass of the AOT process, which happens in memory. So even though you've given it a fully qualified path, that path will never actually exist. It all happens in memory, right? So they're using Node to great effect to create a virtual memory, virtual directory, and do all this stuff in memory, which is much faster anyway. But that's why you have this thing hanging out there that doesn't look quite right. This does exist when this file is actually invoked, right? It parses through, it creates the thing, and then it loads this guy, and we're off and running, and everything works great. And so the build folder for this looks almost exactly the same as the other, right? Bootstrap is not in there. I've got a separate vendor CSS file, but it was worth calling out all the extra hoops that I had to jump through to get AOT working in this, and then back all of that crazy stuff off, right? And go with the cleaner, much more better version, which, by the way, is not only running under the hood today in the CLI when you tell it to, starting with the Angular 5 version of the CLI, that will be the default. So it'll do all this goodness for you under the hood by default. You'll get the super optimized output of this stuff, which is great. So
that is great. Hold on, we got to pause for a minute because Denny won't interrupt, and I don't think he'll ever get a word in edgewise with the two of us because
cool.
We talk a lot and we talk fast.
No worries.
Denny, you want to chime in? You have any comments or questions or snide jokes?
No, nothing like that. But I liked what you said earlier, mainly from a planning perspective. You were talking about how to organize this for your teams, and you talked about trying to identify patterns. And I really thought that was a good mindset to put yourself in. So if you're in the audience and you're thinking, well, how do I plan this, or how do I approach this with my own team, which may be spread out or even just local? I think that was a good place to start that you mentioned was, hey, figure out what are the patterns that we're going to try to use that we can be consistent as we figure out how to go through our upgrade process.
Right.
So I really like that. And then I like this ng-rosetta sounds like it looks like a wonderful place to show the complexities of some of the build setups stuff, which is something we have to learn when we're going to go to upgrade, right? And you've got some of these more peculiar, not so straightforward examples in this project, which is phenomenal, because I know that's the stuff that I know even as I've been looking around online to prepare for this series, it's difficult to find. There's this standard vanilla examples out there, but there's always those special things you're looking for, and there's just no obvious look at, well, how should it look in a working system? So that's what I'm seeing from ng-rosetta, as well as you've talked through the build process stuff, that there's a lot of great stuff here that you may face that's not widely available online. So I think that's great.
Thanks. Okay. Let's see, I have a couple more things to talk through. What's our time frame look like?
Well, we're a little bit over time, but that's okay because I think this is really helpful. So feel free to finish, and we've still got a couple people watching online.
Cool. Okay. Well, only if if it fits your schedule. I don't want to work anybody's evening.
I have all the time in the world for you.
Okay. Cool. Well, it's only 6:15 for me, so I'm not interacting too much. Okay. So let's just talk about a couple last minute things, and then I'll drop off. So. I want to call it the lazy loading stuff. I mentioned in the router, right? So if we do, I wanted to show a completely separate standalone module being loaded. So in this fruit vendor, I actually have a module and a component, right? So let's look at the component. It's about as simple as it gets, right? I've got a template that says, I'm the fruit vendor, right? That's really all it is. And then I've got a module for that. So here's the module. Right, I've got a route. I'm exporting my own route within this module, which is important to note. Right, so call out the router module for child versus for root. If you look at the way we did the original one, so the top level route is defined as for root, right, and that basically initializes the router module and fills it with whatever routes are specified here, right, and that's how that works. That's bread and butter. Everybody does that all day, every day. It's not a big deal. It's when you go to add stuff dynamically on the fly where you start caring about this. So if I had done for a route here, it would have reinitialized the router module and loaded it with these routes, which is just this one route, right? Well, that'd be really bad because I would have wiped out all my parent application's routes. So don't do that, right? Instead, we do for child. And when we do for child, it does not initialize all the components. They're already initialized. They are assumed to be initialized. And it appends whatever routes you feed it as opposed to instantiates starting with those, right? So all I've done is add an extra route to this thing. Simple, no fuss, no muss. And this path is relative to the path that we're already on. It's worth calling out. So when we go back to the resolver, right, we have a module. It imports the routing stuff. We have a declaration of a component. We bootstrap with that component. And that's it. So if we look at the router, again, we're doing load children, right? So the load children mechanism effectively says, defer loading this thing until I actually hit it. And when I hit it, when I go to load the fruit vendor route, this is where your source code is, right? And I can stipulate which item inside that file I need to get. So if for some reason we decided to combine multiple things in there, this hashtag syntax allows me to stipulate which is the starting point within this file, right? So say you're consuming a vendor file or something, you want to load it up, and it's just the one file. This allows you to specify which piece is it. So if I run this, right, back to here, that's so weird. Okay, so we sign in, and then we hit this thing, right? And all this does is route us to the vendor module. So note the route up here is fruit list. When I hit this, right, it goes to fruit vendor. And what it did was tell the router to go load that thing. It loaded it up, parsed it, created the routes, injected the routes, then routed me to fruit vendor / nothing, right? That's the home route within fruit vendor. And that loaded the component and rendered it. And that happened completely dynamically. In fact, it didn't even, it loaded the file on the fly and parsed it and rendered it on the fly. So a really good pattern to get into if your source code starts to get really, really big. Use Webpack to logically compartmentalize your chunks and then lazy load those chunks as part of the progressive web app strategy, where you're using a simple starting point and then web workers in the background to dynamically load some of this stuff. And then combine all that with this so that you're only loading the pieces you really need and let Angular go get the stuff that you need when the user goes to get it. That's a lifesaver for us. We use that all over the place. TS linting and Codelizer, use it. There's no reason not to. It's so simple to include, right? Here's a stock lint configuration file right out of the box. All this yellow stuff is TS lint barking at me saying, hey, you've got stuff that should be that. You've got formatting stuff here. Too many spaces, right? So you can get really, really dialed in on the style of your source code, right? And Codelizer takes it a bit higher and runs that first and gives you some Angular specific stuff. So if you're invoking services incorrectly, if you're declaring properties that aren't used correctly, Codelizer basically does TS linting, but for Angular. So the two things combined are just great. And you can see in the TS lint, the first thing I do, right, is give it the Codelizer piece. And then in Webpack, you'll notice here in the resolve or the rules area, so as a pre-runner, right? So during the build, prior to the build, we run the TS lint stuff. So we're doing a TS lint on all our TypeScript, right? And pass it in the config file. So that gives us really, really good styling control. And you can pass this file around right to your developers, make sure everybody's using the correct stuff. So that's good. With the Karma stuff, one of the things that this is just a huge deal for me. Notice there's no tests folder in here, right? Karma itself is using Webpack. So we're using the Webpack Karma loader, or Karma Webpack loader, I should say. Yeah, right here, right? So because I did this, it allows me to write my Karma unit tests in TypeScript, right? Because I'm letting Webpack do the build for me. So all my source code, both the specifications, the test files, and the source code are all compiled simultaneously, right? They're all run at the same time. And I have a single starting point here for the main spec. This is a fairly common pattern, right? So you load this into Karma, and it basically bootstraps your application and then tells tells Karma, go find everything named spec.ts. So what's cool about that is I can now keep my specs in line with my components. So if I have to reorg the project or move stuff around a little bit, no problem. The spec goes with the source code, right? That's just a huge boon. Having your spec files in a test directory all combined together, there's some benefits to that too, but it becomes a management nightmare if you start moving stuff around. So I highly recommend this, and we found this to be great. So I'm not going to go through all this. Again, this is the TypeScript. This is the Karma unit test written in TypeScript, which means I get IntelliSense off of all this, right? It's just an improvement across the board. Somebody's cat's really angry. Let's see.
That's my cat. She wants out. Sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Jeez, don't get me started on that cat.
We're like home. Okay, so we did Karma main spec. Oh, I ditched Phantom for Chrome Headless. That's another one. Chrome Headless came out in Chrome 60, and that was just last month, I think. So if we, if we look at this thing, right, we do the normal Chrome launcher, right? Nothing fancy here, but instead of using Phantom, if you're going to hook this up to a build server, you don't want to be loading Windows under the hood. You want to use something headless. Phantom was great for that, but Phantom started to get problematic. Just use Chrome Headless instead. It's going to basically use Chrome the way you're used to using it, but it won't launch a window. And so you can run this with your build server, and it's faster and more better, and it's awesome. Let's see, I think we covered all that stuff. Yeah, that's most of the stuff. One interesting story I wanted to share. You guys may run into this, you may not. So I backported the source code between these two projects to create the hybrid, right? I didn't tackle creating a hybrid project first and try to learn Angular 4 along the way. I wrote an Angular 2 application and then ported the Fruit 1.5, the Angular 1.5 application into it, right? And it's worth calling out, my tsconfig file stipulates the output directory. Well, I'm using Webpack now, so it's not doing that anymore. But I had a generated folder. Might still be there. No, that was the old stuff. So under the source, I had a generated folder, and that's where I was sticking the output from my TypeScript, right? And that worked perfectly fine, and that allowed Grunt to make the reference to the file and bring all this stuff in, and that was fine. But the end result was I had a static file that was the output of the build for this thing so that the browser could see it, right? And so it was just called generated, and the Fruit 1.5.js file that was the output of TypeScript, the compiled TypeScript into JavaScript, that's where that lived. When I backported this thing, I created a new shell. I took the Fruit 2.0 application, gutted it, got rid of all of the components, right? Loaded up the ng module or ng upgrade module, and then dropped the Fruit source code in here. And the interesting thing about that was I had inadvertently left the generated file in there when I backported it in, and then I loaded the thing, and because my source code was being referenced as the compiled version, it worked great the first time I used it. Like, oh my God, I'm a freaking genius. I had Webpack just build me an Angular 2 at the time project referencing a series of TypeScript that I don't know if it's compatible or not in with the TypeScript engine in Webpack. And it generated all that stuff into separate bundles, and it worked perfectly. And of course, that wasn't the case at all. I was a complete idiot, and I left the precompiled version in there. So the build had failed. In fact, it ignored the thing entirely. It didn't even know what it was looking at. But I had the reference to the compiled file in there, and the compiled file worked perfectly fine. So I was referencing a precompiled JavaScript. I'm an idiot. That took me about 5 minutes to find. But man, that first elation of watching the source code run, right? You see this thing, and it just goes, oh, it works. That's the coolest thing ever. I did it, and I didn't realize that the entire application had basically been imported in from another file directory and had already been worked. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, that was fun. So again, the concept of the patterns, it's worth calling out again. I know you guys went over the upgrade piece, so I won't say too much, but I had to change my TypeScript implementation of the legacy source code to make this work, right? So not terribly, but I'm using import statements now as opposed to triple hash references. I was able to get rid of the index .d file to map all that stuff together because the module file is doing it for me. Now, again, not the Angular module, the AngularJS module, but now I'm doing an import here across the board. The individual modules, the individual components here reference the stuff is necessary. So getting the items in question, here we go. Yeah, so pulling the fruit item in was nothing more than referencing the actual fruit item. I renamed this to fruit.model. This was the remainder of that fruit index file. It didn't need it to be there anymore. I just didn't rename the file, but that had to happen. So coming next, if you're watching this space, if you're able to use this, if this is of value to you, I am in the process of adding Karma test coverage to this, so you'll get a report showing what actually was tested. We've done that internally all over the place. I just need to backport that into this thing. I am also creating a whole new project for this series. It'll be called Fruit CLI, and it is what happens to your application when you migrate it into the CLI, right? How do you do that? How do you scaffold a new project using the ng-CLI, the Angular CLI, and take your pre-existing product and get it in there? So I'm halfway through that. That'll end up being a 5th project in here, and will probably be where I live for a while. As they upgrade the CLI, I'll be sticking on that. And then, of course, going back and removing promises and getting RxJS, getting a better example of RxJS eventing to work. I'm a huge fan. The concept of working with streams of observables it's a beautiful concept. The syntax breaks my head. So I've gone through a couple of chapters. ng-book does a great job of describing the object model first and then applying the templates to an observable object model. So I highly recommend that one again. And that's mostly me.
That's awesome. That was a very good and detailed walkthrough, and I appreciate that. And just for anybody who's still hanging on, watching this YouTube, there is the whole thing is on GitHub, which is actually where we found it, and it's awesome. So it's called ng-rosetta. And obviously quite a lot of work and expertise went into that. So I appreciate you distilling all of your knowledge into something that other people can use. That's awesome.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. You're most welcome. This is a blast.
Yeah, this was cool. Denny, you have anything to add?
No, that was great, David. That's an excellent resource. And just remember, ng-rosetta, as you look for examples, as you start to upgrade your own projects, tremendous resource. If you don't mind, I'll go through these last slides. We'll just close it out here, Bonnie.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, you guys see that? Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, great. So we just want to cover a few lessons learned. Main thing is that we know there are several upgrade paths we can take. It's worthwhile to do some transformation of your AngularJS code into those components to ease that transition to Angular. It can be tricky to set up that initial build system, but it'll simplify the development later. We covered that a little bit last week, and then what we just saw from ng-rosetta, I think, tremendously helpful as you're setting up your build system when you start your upgrade for your own project. And then you want to think about the third-party dependencies that your project has as well. So if you're relying on something like Firebase, you want to learn about how Firebase looks in the new Angular world, with Angular Fire 2, for example. There's a few other resources besides ng-rosetta, just some things we want to highlight. There's some good documentation really on the Angular website itself. There's a link there. There's a nice lengthy article, but it was very helpful to figure out how to prepare for an upgrade and how to even use the ng upgrade library. And then there's the company ThoughtRam. They've got a decent blog article, among others, talking specifically about upgrading apps there. And then Tero Parvinen has some excellent information from maybe 2 years ago, where he was producing presentations on YouTube, as well as some articles. We have a link here where he's talking about how to transform your Angular 1.5 code, AngularJS code, into something that is a shape that's more befitting of an Angular app. So if you're in the preparation stage, check out Tero's stuff online. If you're looking for videos, look for videos from Angular Air and NG Houston. Of course, you'll see this series will be there. We've got 5 videos, I think, now we'll have covering these 6 areas of focus that we've covered throughout this month. And then online courses, our guest panelist last week, Sam Julien, is preparing a comprehensive Angular upgrade course. If you want information about that, email this email here, kip@upgradingangularjs.com. Continue to follow NG Houston, Sam Julien, and me, Developing Denny, on Twitter. Contact me if you have any questions about upgrade. I'll be happy to help. And of course, Taro's stuff as well, his handle is there. And then if you're looking for professional upgrade resources, there's a few companies that we know of that can help you with that. The first is Oasis Digital. They provided some excellent panelists for us here in NG Houston. They've proven to be professional and to have a lot of experience and expertise in Angular and in upgrading as well. There's Narwhal Technologies, and these are some names you may recognize. These guys are part of that company. Everybody from Victor Savkin, Jeff Cross, and Justin Schwarzenberger as well. And then the company ThoughtRam as well. Guys like Pascal Precht and Thomas Burleson are part of that company. There are also resources available if you need professional help to organize or implement your enterprise scale upgrade. And then in general, throughout the series, we learned something very important, which is we can upgrade. We just need to plan it out. We have the knowledge now and the tools, I think, to move to Angular after going through our series here. And I think if you're looking to move into Angular, you should try to start taking some of these steps as quickly as possible so you can take advantage of everything that Angular has to offer and is continuing to bring to the table of front-end development. So that's the conclusion of our series. Thanks for everyone who's been with us. I want to thank all of our panelists. David, today, you're phenomenal. Thank you very much for your time and effort and joining us today. Of course, Sam Julien last week, all the guys from Oasis Digital that joined us throughout the panel. And last but not least, Bonnie, without which this series would not have been possible. So thanks, everybody, for making this series possible. We hope this has helped you plan and implement your upgrade. And contact us with any questions you have.
Thank you, Denny. That was really awesome, this whole thing. I know you put a whole lot of work into it. And I was about to add, I was looking at your resources, and I was just getting ready to say, don't forget the consultants, because we know a couple of companies that can actually come in and help you. And then you switch to the next slide, and I was like, man, Denny's got it all covered. It was awesome. This was a really good series, and I hope for those of you, we actually had a couple extra people jump on right at the tail end of it, because I'm watching how many people are watching. So if you're seeing this and you're just jumping on at the end, there are more videos, lots more videos, and you guys went into so much detail. So hopefully this will help other people going through this. Thank you so much, and thank you, David, for coming on. And was that a picture of your wife?
Yeah, I was gonna try to. Here we go. Yeah.
Because I was talking.
There you go.
They got it.
There.
Oh,
now
they're
so
all
on YouTube, right? Good deal.
Adorable.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. It's getting late, so we'll just wrap this up. But it was really fun having you guys, and we will see you both soon.
Right on. Thanks very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.